Freddie Gray's death and the events that followed thrust West Baltimore's Sandtown neighborhood into the national spotlight. Sandtown has faced and continues to face high levels of poverty and an array of related challenges. And while the neighborhood is now receiving national attention and some new support, the question remains, how many neighborhoods face the same level of challenge as Sandtown but aren't making their way into the national headlines? My name is Dan Princiata. I'm a PhD student at the Johns Hopkins University School of Education. And in this segment of our colloquium on unpacking poverty in West Baltimore, I'm going to discuss what we found when trying to answer the question, how many Sandtowns are there nationwide? So in order to answer that question, the first thing that we needed to do was to identify a data source. We were looking for a data set that had nationwide coverage down to the neighborhood level, that was recent, and that contained publicly available data on a wide array of topics. So the data source that we identified, that we ended up using, was the American Community Survey, and more specifically, data from the American Community Survey from 2009 to 2013. So the American Community Survey reports data down to the census tract level, which is similar to, but not exactly the same as what a resident would consider a neighborhood. And so here on this slide, we can see the Sandtown-Winchester neighborhood. Its boundaries are in black, and we can see some surrounding neighborhoods. And in red, we see the boundaries of census tracts. And census tracts are geographically contiguous areas that are small. They're typically bounded by things like streets or rivers or parks, things that would be reasonable boundaries, but they might not line up with the boundaries of neighborhoods the way residents would perceive them. So here we see that there are 6 different census tracts that intersect with the Sandtown neighborhood. But these tracts also overlap with other neighborhoods like Harlem Park, Midtown Edmondson, and Easterwood. The next step for us was to identify indicators that distinguish Sandtown from other neighborhoods in both Baltimore City and Maryland. And in order to do that, we took a look at over 1,500 potential indicators. And we were looking for indicators that did a couple of things. We wanted indicators that would show substantial differences between Sandtown, Baltimore City, and Maryland, that would address various aspects of community, including economics, housing, demographics, and we wanted indicators that had face validity, that were important on the surface and based on expert judgment. And so via this process, we identified 15 indicators down from our overall sample of 1,500 that we considered. Now, an important thing to note is that the indicators we chose distinguish between Sandtown and other geographies, but at least for some of the indicators, there was substantial variation within Sandtown across the 6 census tracts that we were examining. So, for example, the first indicator that we chose was the percentage of the total population that is female. So we can see that in Sandtown, 56% of the population was female, compared with 53% in Baltimore City and 52% in Maryland. Across the Sandtown census tracts, we saw that this indicator ranged from 51% to 57%. This indicator was one that we selected because it was related to this idea of missing men that we spoke about earlier. A second indicator, which really gets at the segregation that is present in the Sandtown neighborhood, is the percentage of the total population that is white. We can see that compared to 54% of the total population for Maryland and 28% of Baltimore City's population being white, in Sandtown it's just 1% of the total population. A third indicator that we identified was the percentage of households with one or more child headed by a married couple. And we can see that just 16% of households with a child had a married couple heading the household in Sandtown, compared with 35% in Baltimore City and 64% in Maryland. And again, across the census tracts within Sandtown, we see substantial variation on this indicator. Getting at the idea of educational attainment, an element of socioeconomic status, we see this indicator, which is the percentage of adults aged 25 and above with a bachelor's degree or higher. We can see that just 7% of residents in Sandtown who are 25 years old and above had a bachelor's degree, compared with 27% in Baltimore City and 37% in Maryland. The percentage of the population aged 16 and above that is employed is the next indicator in our set of 15, and we can see that only 42% of the population aged 16 and above was employed in Sandtown, compared with 53% in Baltimore City and 63% in Maryland. Now, among the employed population aged 16 and above, what percent are working in white-collar occupations? In Sandtown, it's less than 1 in 5, just 18% of the population were working in white-collar occupations, compared with 38% in Baltimore City and 44% in Maryland. Another indicator we identified was median household income. In Sandtown, the median household income was $27,000, compared with $46,000 in Baltimore City and $80,000 in Maryland. And again, we can see that there is substantial variation across census tracts within Sandtown, although generally they're all lower than Baltimore City and Maryland. Another indicator we selected was percentage of households with interest, dividends, or net rental income. And this is really a way at getting at household wealth. We can see that in Sandtown, just 3% of households had assets that generated interest, dividends, or rental income, compared with 13% in Baltimore City and just about a quarter in Maryland. Another indicator that distinguished between Sandtown, Baltimore City, and Maryland was income per capita, where there were wide differences between Sandtown, Baltimore City, and Maryland. One of the things that you might notice driving around the Sandtown neighborhood is that there are a number of obviously vacant buildings, and we can see from the ACS data that about a third of housing units in Sandtown are vacant and not for rent or sale, compared with just 12% in Baltimore City and 7% in Maryland. Another indicator that we selected as distinguishing Sandtown from Baltimore City and Maryland was the median value of owner-occupied housing units. You can see wide discrepancies here, where the median owner-occupied housing unit in Sandtown was worth about $82,000, compared with Baltimore City, where the median unit was worth $177,000, and Maryland, where the median value of owner-occupied housing units was $326,000. An important indicator here is the percentage of children ages 0 to 17 living in poverty. We see that about 4 in 10 children are living in poverty in Sandtown, compared with about a third of children in Baltimore City and just over 1 in 10 children living in poverty in Maryland. And this indicator is one where we see some wide variation across the census tracts that make up Sandtown. We're going to look further into this. It's possible that some of this is just random noise based on the ACS data collection, but we also know that in census tract 160300, for example, where there's a relatively low percentage of children living in poverty, this is also an area where there has been some housing redevelopment. So this is something where it's unclear whether the variation we're seeing at the tract level is real or not, but when we aggregate tract level data to the entire area of Sandtown, we're seeing something that is distinguishing Sandtown from Baltimore City and Maryland at large. Another indicator we identified was the percentage of the total population living at or above 200% of poverty. So these are people who are not poor, they're not near poor, they're economically speaking doing okay. And so about 4 in 10 residents of Sandtown are doing okay. They're living up at or above 200% of the poverty threshold, compared with 55% in Baltimore City and 77% in Maryland. The percentage of the population under age 17 with private health insurance was another indicator that really distinguished between Sandtown, Baltimore City, and Maryland, with just 1 in 5 children under age 17 having private health insurance in Sandtown, compared with about 4 in 10 in Baltimore City and just about 7 in 10 in Maryland. For our final indicator, we identified the percentage of commuters ages 16 and above who travel to work in half an hour or less. Even though in Baltimore City we see more short commute times, with 56% of commuters making it to work in half an hour or less, compared with 50% in Maryland, in the Sandtown neighborhood we're seeing just 40% of commuters ages 16 and above getting to work in half an hour or less. Now that we had a set of indicators that really helped us distinguish between Sandtown, Baltimore City, and Maryland, we needed to step back and look across the more than 70,000 census tracts in the United States and figure out what thresholds we were going to use for each of those 15 indicators to say whether or not a census tract was like a Sandtown census tract. After considering several different approaches, the one that we came up with that we thought made the most sense in terms of identifying thresholds for indicators was to look at penultimate maximums, or for some indicators, penultimate minimums. And the best way to understand that is really through an example. So this is the indicator that we talked about, focused on the percentage of households with one or more child under age 18 headed by a married couple. So we can see that the Sandtown weighted average was 16 across the 6 different census tracts. But again, there was variation across those census tracts. So how were we going to decide what was like a census tract in Sandtown and what was dissimilar? So what we thought was that we would set the threshold such that 5 out of the 6 census tracts that intersect with Sandtown met the threshold. So we set the threshold for this indicator at around 19, as opposed to setting it at 28 or at some other level like 16. And we thought that this was a reasonable approach to identifying census tracts that are like those that intersect with the Sandtown neighborhood in Baltimore. So this slide presents those thresholds that we identified. I'm not going to read them to you, but I will pause for a moment so that you can take a look at them yourselves and see the thresholds that we utilized. So now that we had our thresholds for each of our 15 indicators, we needed to choose an overall criteria for being a Sandtown. And in order to do that, we needed to take a look at what percentage of neighborhoods met each of the individual thresholds that we had identified. So this slide presents the percentage of neighborhoods meeting individual Sandtown thresholds for our 15 indicators. For our first one listed here, percent female, we can see that there are 23% of census tracts nationwide that have a similar level of percent female to that in the Sandtown neighborhood. And you can also see on this slide that for some indicators, Sandtown was very dissimilar from most census tracts across the country. With respect to percent white, the percentage of households with children that are headed by 2 married parents, the percentage of residents with a bachelor's degree or higher, and the prevalence of vacant housing. These are all indicators that are really actually very difficult for most census tracts nationwide to meet. So considering the previous slide, what we landed on was that for a census tract from anywhere in the country to be identified as being quite similar to a census tract intersecting with the Sandtown neighborhood, that census tract would need to meet thresholds for 12 out of the 15 indicators. So for 80% of the 15 indicators that we're looking at, we wanted that the census tract in question to be similar to Sandtown in order to say that overall this neighborhood is like the Sandtown neighborhood. So using these criteria, we identified 177 Sandtowns. That is 177 census tracts out of 73,285 census tracts across the entire country. This translates to just 1/4 of a percentage point of all neighborhoods. These neighborhoods were located in 81 counties across 25 states or territories. And, again, this is based on our criteria of 80% of the indicators being met. If we dropped the difficulty of being similar to a Sandtown to saying that, for example, only 11 out of the 15 thresholds would need to be met, then we would bump up our 177 number to 519. And if we dropped it to just 10 out of the 15 indicators, it would go up to 1,152 neighborhoods, which would still only be about 1.5% of neighborhoods nationwide. And so for comparison, if we were just looking at, for example, neighborhoods with a level of poverty of 40% or higher, there are 3,570 census tracts that meet that threshold. And so really what we see is that when we look at a whole constellation of factors that help identify the Sandtown neighborhood, there are not that many of them across the country, but there are a number. And here we can see a geographic representation of Sandtowns nationwide. So here we can see our breakdown of Sandtowns by state, and it is interesting to note that Maryland does not lead in the number of neighborhoods that are like Sandtown. That distinction belongs to Michigan, with 28 census tracts that are similar to the census tracts that intersect with Sandtown. There are 24 in Illinois, and 15 each in New York and Puerto Rico. When we look at the specific counties that contain census tracts like those tracts that intersect with Sandtown, we see that Wayne County, Michigan leads the way with 18, and Wayne County is Detroit and surrounding cities. Cook County, Illinois has 16. This is Chicago. In Philadelphia, there were 7, and you can see on down the list. So the big takeaways from our analysis are that few neighborhoods face the specific constellation of challenges that Sandtown does. That being said, comparable neighborhoods do exist, and in some cases in even higher concentrations than in Baltimore. And our analysis underscores both the multitude of challenges facing high-need communities and also the importance of unpacking poverty. If we want to intervene successfully in high-need communities and schools, we really need to do a good job of teasing apart and understanding the specific challenges facing the populations that we're trying to help. And in so doing, we think that we have a greater chance of being successful in our efforts.